case we have never met, I'm Michael Price, and I want to help you succeed in growing your business.
Welcome. I'm Michael Price, your host.
And I'm Nancy, your co-host. Today is May 5th, 2026.
You know, usually when you sign a contract to, say, build a house or maybe buy a new car, there is this expectation of strict precision.
Right.
Like the blueprint shows a 3-bedroom layout, the dealer shows you a sedan, and you just point and say, you know, there it is, and here's the exact price.
Exactly. It's a known quantity.
But step into the world of federal government contracts like building next-generation defense systems or modernizing these incredibly complex multi-agency IT infrastructures, and half the blueprint is just missing.
Yeah, completely missing.
And overnight, this new executive order just dropped. That basically forces contractors to lock in fixed prices for projects that haven't even been fully invented yet.
It's wild. It creates this contractual landscape defined by, financial muddy waters. I mean, when an agency commissions something completely unprecedented, neither side actually knows the true cost until they are deep into the work.
Right.
So forcing a rigid price structure onto these inherently fluid projects completely alters the risk calculus for anyone doing business with the government.
Absolutely. So we are going to give you, our listener, your exact playbook for surviving this fallout. Welcome to today's deep dive. We are pulling from a stack of recent notes dated May 5th, 2026, alongside a really detailed legal analysis from the law firm Blank Rome LLP.
It's a great analysis, really granular.
It is, and our sources note that this executive order, which basically makes fixed-price contracts the new default, was signed by President Trump on April 30th, 2026. And, hey, just as a quick reminder to you, we're simply unpacking the legal and operational analysis of this EO exactly as it was written. We aren't endorsing any political viewpoints behind it. We're just looking at the facts on the ground.
Right. Our goal today is strictly to decode what this mandate means for you operationally.
Yes, exactly. We want to explain exactly how you can use FAR 16.2012 as a legal shield and walk you through a step-by-step survival strategy for these mandatory 90-day renegotiation windows that this order just triggered.
Because honestly, having a structured response ready is literally the only thing standing between maintaining a viable federal practice and absorbing, catastrophic financial losses.
Yeah, the stakes are that high. So let's unpack this. The entire landscape of federal contracting just tilted overnight, and we are going to make sure you have the playbook. But before we get to the defense strategy, we need to talk about the sheer scale of the dollars driving this policy.
Oh, the numbers are staggering.
In fiscal year 2024 alone, the government spent roughly $120 billion on cost-reimbursement consulting contracts.
$120 billion.
Right? So from the government's perspective, that is a vast amount of taxpayer money tied up in a structure where they basically bear the brunt of cost overruns. The whole intent of the new EO is to just take that burden and shift it directly onto the contractor.
It's a classic transfer of liability, but looking at the historical context from our sources, this isn't actually a new fight. This is a tug of war we've seen play out for almost 2 decades.
Wait, really? 2 decades?
Yeah. Back in 2009, President Obama issued a memorandum trying to establish a policy preference for fixed price models because obligations had basically doubled. And then the very next year, the Department of Defense rolled out its Better Buying Power initiative.
Oh, I remember reading about that in the notes.
Yeah, and that was specifically to push fixed price incentive contracts, or FPIs.
Let's actually pause on that mechanism for a second, because understanding FPIs is really crucial for you if you're navigating this space. An FPI doesn't just slap a single hard number on the project, right?
Right. No, it's more dynamic.
It sets a target cost, a target profit, a ceiling price, and a share ratio. So if the contractor comes in under budget, they get a larger share of the profit. But if they go over,
their profit just dwindles.
Exactly. It dwindles until they hit the ceiling, at which point they eat every single additional dollar.
And that mechanism sounds excellent in theory for controlling costs, which is exactly why the DoD pushed it so hard back then. And strictly in terms of adoption volume, the push actually worked.
The numbers went way up, didn't they?
Massively. The Government Accountability Office tracked the data and found that obligations on FPI contracts for major defense programs soared from $1.3 billion in 2010 to $32 billion by 2019.
Wow.
Yeah, it grew from 17% of the share to nearly half.
So on paper, that looks like a massive bureaucratic victory for the government.
It does, but here's the problem, and this is straight from the GAO findings. The DoD never formally assessed whether that massive shift actually improved cost and schedule performance outcomes.
Are you serious? They didn't check?
They never checked. They mandated this huge structural change without ever gathering the data to prove that an FPI contract yielded a cheaper or faster weapons system than a cost reimbursement approach would have in that exact same scenario.
I mean, it's like a gym membership. The government keeps signing up for these fixed price initiatives, buying all the new workout gear, but the GAO found they never actually step on the scale to see if they're losing weight.
That is a perfect analogy. They just know the contracts look different.
Right, and if you don't know the actual outcome, you're just flying blind.
Exactly. And because those previous initiatives failed to produce, definitively proven cost savings, the current administration isn't just relying on policy preferences anymore. They are installing severe bureaucratic roadblocks.
Incredibly severe.
Yes. The 2026 EO introduces an administrative obstacle course that's basically designed to make non-fixed price structures incredibly painful for agencies to approve. Any exception now requires a written justification.
And it isn't just stopped at a written justification. The analysis points out that for the heavier investments, the actual head of the relevant agency has to provide an official sign-off.
Right, not just a mid-level manager.
No, the agency head. And the thresholds for that signature vary based on the agency, like it's $100 million for the DoD.
Which makes sense for their size.
Yeah, but then it's $35 million for NASA, $25 million for the Department of Homeland Security, and just $10 million for all other federal agencies.
And the logic behind those varying thresholds is purely operational. I mean, the DoD's procurement budget is exponentially larger than most civilian agencies. If their threshold was set at $10 million, the Secretary of Defense would spend their entire day just signing waivers.
Just a stack of papers.
Exactly. But for a smaller agency, a $10 million non-fixed price contract is a significant chunk of their portfolio, so it warrants top-level scrutiny. Plus, every single non-fixed price contract that does get approved has to be reported to the Office of Management and Budget twice a year.
Reading this, it feels psychologically designed to exhaust contracting officers.
Oh, 100%.
If a CEO has to go all the way up to the head of NASA just to get a signature for a cost reimbursement structure, they're going to look for any possible way to just cram the project into a fixed price model. It makes fixed price the path of least administrative resistance.
That deliberate bottleneck creates intense operational pressure at the agency level, and that pressure is compounded by what is arguably the most aggressive component of this whole EO, which is the ticking clock.
The 90-day mandate.
Yes. Agencies are under a strict mandate to review their 10 largest non-fixed price contracts within 90 days. They have to assess if they can force a conversion right now.
And with further OMB guidance dropping in 45 days and mandatory training for procurement staff due in 120 days, the pace is just relentless.
It is.
I mean, if agencies are under a 90-day gun to review their top 10 contracts, doesn't that put intense pressure on them to force contractors into bad deals just to check a compliance box, regardless of whether the work is actually suited for a fixed price?
That is the exact hazard you as a contractor are facing right now. When the government's priority shifts from technical feasibility to, compliance velocity, contractors end up holding the bag on unquantifiable risks. And you cannot simply explain to a contracting officer that a project is too risky. They don't care. They have a presidential directive to satisfy, so you have to provide them with a regulatory off-ramp.
Okay, so this is where you, the listener, need to wield FAR 16.3012. It is your absolute strongest legal shield here. The regulation explicitly dictates that cost reimbursement contracts are the appropriate choice when, and I'm quoting directly here, uncertainties involved in contract performance do not permit costs to be estimated with sufficient accuracy to use any type of fixed price contract.
Sufficient accuracy, that is the magic phrase.
Exactly.
The strategic value of citing FAR 16.3012 is that it changes the entire nature of the conversation. You aren't just, whining about risk exposure. You are actively utilizing the government's own procurement law to demonstrate that a fixed price model is legally impractical.
But how does a contractor actually build that case in real life? The notes emphasize aggressive documentation. You have to catalog both known and unknown risks, highlighting literally every area of scope. And
Ooh, I get it all on paper.
like, if you are dealing with software modernization, you point out the legacy code dependencies that haven't been mapped. If it's hardware, you highlight supply chain volatility for unproven materials. And for brand new procurements, you need to be highly visible at industry days and Q&A sessions.
Yes, you have to actively put your concerns about scope uncertainty on the official record long before a solicitation is even drafted. You are effectively doing the contracting officer's homework for them.
Make it easy for them.
Exactly. By providing a rigorously documented case of why costs cannot be estimated with sufficient accuracy, you give them the exact legal justification they need to take up the chain of command to secure that required agency head sign-off.
Okay, but let me play devil's advocate here for a second.
Sure.
You can quote the FAR all day and your documentation might be pristine, but if the head of an agency has a strict mandate to show progress on fixed price conversions, is pointing to a paragraph in the regulations genuinely enough to stop a $50 million contract from being flipped?
That's the million-dollar question, and the honest answer is on its own. Pointing to the text won't stop the momentum. The regulation only works if it is backed by hard financial realities. You have to present the agency with a binary choice. You show them that forcing a fixed price means you will either artificially inflate your bid to cover massive unknown contingencies, which cost the taxpayer way more.
Right? We don't know, so we're charging double premium.
Exactly. Or the other option is you'll be forced to submit a dangerously low bid that jeopardizes the actual completion of the mission. And when you frame it as a threat to mission success supported by that FAR 16.301-2 framework, the agency actually has the legal cover to back down.
Okay, so you are building an undeniable case file, and that leads us to the operational core of our analysis today, because citing the FAR is your legal foundation. But when that 90-day review actually triggers a renegotiation demand that lands on your desk, you need a really granular survival strategy.
You need a checklist.
Exactly. Based on the blank Rome analysis, we have constructed a chronological narrative, a checklist of how you should navigate these 90 days. Let's walk through it.
Step 1. Do not immediately agree. The moment the modification request arrives, the instinct for a lot of contractors is to play ball, right? To maintain a good relationship with their federal customer.
Sure, nobody wants to rock the boat.
But that instinct is so dangerous under this EO. Your very first move must be to pause and evaluate your internal estimation capabilities. Ask yourself honestly, can we accurately predict our costs for the remainder of this life cycle? And if there is any hesitation, you must hold the line.
And once you hold that line, step 2 is you have to transition to building a new pricing model. But the analysis explicitly warns against taking the lazy route here. You cannot simply take your historical cost reimbursement run rates, tack on a 15% contingency, and call it your new fixed price.
No, that's a disaster waiting to happen. You have to evaluate the entire risk profile from the ground up.
Right? Because if you try to adapt an old estimate, you are just carrying over old assumptions.
Exactly. In a cost reimbursement structure, an estimate is essentially a moving target. If you miss it, the government absorbs the variance. But under a fixed price, if you miss it, that variance entirely erases your profit margin. It's similar to the house metaphor you used earlier.
Yeah, like if you move into a new house, you don't estimate your utility bills based on what you paid at your old apartment. You have to inspect the new wiring, the insulation, the literal foundation.
Right, and crucially, in this fixed price government scenario, if you find faulty wiring behind the walls after you sign, you can't just go to the bank for a bigger loan. You pay for the rewiring out of your own pocket.
Ouch.
Yeah, that is why your ground-up pricing model has to explicitly price in the shock of discovering that bad wiring.
Okay, so step 3 on our checklist. As you build that rigorous model, you inevitably run into the issue of scope. To protect a fixed price, you have to define your deliverables with extreme precision. You have to lock down the definition of a finished product tighter than Fort Knox.
Because scope creep is the silent killer of fixed price contracts.
Oh, absolutely.
The second an agency asks for a minor tweak or a subtle feature enhancement or an accelerated timeline that is uncompensated labor, unless your deliverables are defined with absolute mathematical clarity, you have to build ironclad boundaries around a pricing model.
And step 4 is part of building those boundaries, which requires scrutinizing the data the government gives you to bid against. I mean, if you're listening, you've probably been handed a spreadsheet by an agency before that they called notional.
Oh, notional.
Right. All sources warn that if you accept notional estimates, which is essentially just a polite bureaucratic term for a complete guess, you are walking into a trap.
It is incredibly difficult to secure an equitable adjustment later when those notional estimates inevitably prove inaccurate. The government will just argue that you assume the risk of the guess.
So how do you counter it?
During the 90-day window, you must demand actual workload metrics or full-time equivalent, FTE, data from predecessor contracts. Force the negotiation to be based on historical reality, not optimistic projections.
Okay, step 5. Even with precise scope and historical data, you are still absorbing massive macroeconomic risks, so you have to demand protective clauses in the new modification.
This is critical.
Specifically, you should push for an economic price adjustment or EPA clause to combat inflation. You could even point out that the DoD itself issued guidance back in 2022 recommending the use of EPA clauses to equitably balance inflation risk during volatile periods.
Right, and you structure an EPA clause by tying specific cost elements like raw materials or specialized labor to independent economic indices. If the index spikes above a certain threshold, the contract price adjusts automatically. You're capping your exposure to risks you simply cannot control.
And you also need to push for a price realism clause, right?
Yes, this is a vital strategic move, especially if the agency decides to recompete the work entirely rather than just modify your existing contract. In a fixed price environment, there is this immense temptation for competitors to submit a lowball bid just to win the revenue, fully intending to figure out the complexities later.
And a foot in the door.
Exactly. A price realism clause forces the government to evaluate whether a proposed price is so dangerously low that it reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of the technical requirements. It prevents incumbent contractors who actually know the true cost of the work from being undercut by a competitor submitting what amounts to a suicide bid.
Okay, and the final step of our checklist, step 6. While you are negotiating all these clauses, you have to deeply scrutinize the legal fine print of the modification itself. The government will often try to slip in waiver or release language that forces you to surrender your right to claim past costs or dispute previous changes in exchange for signing the new terms.
They sneak that in all the time, and really that entire chronological process we just outlined, from the initial pause to the ground-up pricing, the demand for historical data, and the insistence on protective clauses, it serves a dual purpose.
It protects your balance sheet, obviously.
Yes, but strategically, it forces the agency to acknowledge the unvarnished cost of transferring risk. When you hand them a ground-up fixed price estimate that accounts for every contingency, the final number is going to be substantially higher than their old cost reimbursement projections.
So you are showing them the actual premium they have to pay for certainty.
Exactly.
But, let's look at the reality of how these negotiations often end. What happens when your rigorous model proves that a pure fixed price is astronomically high, but the agency refuses to maintain a standard cost reimbursement structure because of the new EO? Does the project just stall out completely?
That is where the 90-day review will likely conclude for the most complex technical challenges, but the executive order actually anticipates this gridlock and provides a specific escape hatch.
Oh, really?
Yeah, performance-based incentives. The directive states that if a contract simply cannot be converted to a firm fixed price, agencies should incorporate performance metrics.
Okay, this means integrating the incentive structures we discussed earlier, like FPIs or tying award fees directly to objective cost and schedule targets. So it's basically the ultimate middle ground.
It is. It satisfies the fundamental goal of the EO, which is to shift risk away from the taxpayer and enforce stricter oversight. I mean, a pure cost reimbursement contract doesn't accomplish that. But if you maintain a structure where the underlying costs are reimbursed while making the contractor's profit entirely dependent on their ability to deliver results efficiently, you bridge the gap.
So is this actually a win-win then? Like the contractor isn't forced to swallow the catastrophic risk of a multi-million-dollar overrun if an experimental technology fails, but they are highly motivated financially to keep costs tightly managed.
Exactly. The government gets to demonstrate compliance with the spirit of the EO, and the contractor keeps a highly uncertain project alive without betting their entire company on a wild guess. It is the most viable landing zone for the complex projects currently caught in the crosshairs of this policy shift.
That makes total sense.
And understanding how to guide a contracting officer toward that middle ground using your documented risk models as leverage is just essential right now.
Man, we have covered immense ground today to get you ready for this shift. We started by exploring the $120 billion footprint of cost reimbursement contracts and the historical struggles from Obama's 2009 memo to the DoD's completely unmeasured push for FPIs that basically led to this aggressive 2026 executive order.
We detailed the new bureaucratic roadblocks, explaining why agency head thresholds differ and how that 90-day ticking clock places immense pressure on procurement officials to force conversions.
And most importantly, we mapped out your defense. We discussed how to utilize FAR 16.3012 to legally demonstrate that cost cannot be estimated with sufficient accuracy. We watched chronologically through the renegotiation strategy checklist, pausing to evaluate capabilities, building ground-up models, finding notional data, demanding protective clauses like price realism, and ultimately negotiating those performance-based incentives as a sustainable compromise.
Because the federal procurement landscape is reorganizing itself rapidly, whether you are prepping for a sudden contract review next week or you are simply tracking long-term trends to protect your pipeline, staying anchored to the regulatory mechanics of how risk is transferred is non-negotiable.
Yeah, this knowledge is what prevents you from being steamrolled when the rules of the game change overnight. The contractors who survive a massive regulatory tilt like this are the ones who understand the mechanics of the rule book better than the government officials trying to enforce it.
Absolutely.
But as we close out this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final thought to ponder. We know that building experimental cutting-edge systems, whether it's AI infrastructure or advanced aerospace tech, is fundamentally murky and unpredictable. If this executive order achieves its ultimate goal, and every massive complex federal project is successfully crammed into a fixed price box where contractors bear the entirety of the financial risk, well, will it inadvertently kill innovation?
That is a profound risk.
Right? Will the industrial base simply become too terrified of bankrupting cost overruns to ever propose a truly cutting-edge experimental solution to the government again?
If the financial penalty for failure becomes absolute, contractors will naturally just stop attempting to do genuinely hard things.
It's definitely something to think about as you navigate this new fixed price reality. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
A special thank you to MarketUS.com for furnishing us this information. You can reach them at MarketUS.com or call them at 954-636-3232. Before we go, this deep dive was created by the MarketUS.com team. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. It's right below the subscribe link.